sorry for the technical issues. So we are very happy to have Suryanarayana Sankagiri with us today. He did his BTech from here, IIT Bombay, and PhD from UIUC, and currently he is a postdoc at EPFL. Right. And he'll tell us about some recent work on blockchains.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to give a Trust Lab colloquium. Today I'll be speaking on the topic of the robustness of blockchains to network delays. This is a topic that I have been working on for much of my PhD, and I'm happy to get a chance to share it with you. I want to begin with a bit of a historical perspective on the research that has been done over the last decade on the security of blockchain, so that it's easier to place this work in the broader context. So the term blockchain itself was coined when Bitcoin was first invented in 2009. Bitcoin, as many of you would know, is a digital transactions system, and its uniqueness that sets it apart from all previous systems is that it's completely decentralized. There is no agency, no one agency that's controlling the whole system. So clearly, for such a system, security is important. You want a transaction system to be secure, and this was recognized in the first paper itself. A proof sketch was given where, among other things, a rather unique property of Bitcoin was identified, which is if you are willing to wait longer for your transaction to be confirmed, then you have stronger security, and we'll see shortly why that is the case. Around 2013 or 14, people in academia started taking interest in Bitcoin, and this particular paper by Gary et al. In 2014 gave the first formal security proof of Bitcoin. Namely, they proposed a mathematical model, they clearly stated a security objective, and they proved under certain conditions Bitcoin achieves those security objectives. So this paper was the foundation based on which there was a lot of work in the following few years, and each paper slightly refined the security analysis to give better and better guarantees. In 2020, an important breakthrough was made where tight asymptotic security guarantees were given. Namely, they show that if conditions are such and such, you have security, and if not, security will definitely be violated. But these were in an infinite time regime, and much more recently these were tightened to give good finite time security guarantees. And along the way, people also realized that the core engineering problem that Bitcoin is trying to solve is that of consensus. Namely, a group of peers must agree on an ever-changing state of the system. And classical consensus dates back to the early 1980s, where there are many protocols as well as many impossibility results, and there's been a healthy exchange of ideas between the blockchain community and the classical consensus community. So our interest is really to examine what are the network assumptions under which these guarantees are made. Are they realistic or are they unrealistic, and can we relax some of these conditions? So one thing that strikes one is when we examine the literature is that all security results on Bitcoin assume bounded communication delays, which means that any message sent by one person to another must reach within some fixed time delta, and this delta is known ahead of time. So arguably this is somewhat unrealistic over a network that's spread over the whole world. People are joined in the Bitcoin system from across the globe. And strictly speaking, one could take a large enough delay bound, say 1 hour, any message is guaranteed to reach within 1 hour. But if you take such a large delay bound, you get really pessimistic results. So is there any way that one could relax this assumption? And people have of course asked this question in the past, especially if one looks at the classical consensus literature. There are two classes of protocols: those that are designed to work in a bounded delay regime, and those that are designed to work in an unbounded delay regime. Namely, they work whenever messages, they proceed whenever messages are delivered. Of course, there are some trade-offs between to be made for this kind of protocol. So a natural question to ask is Bitcoin secure in asynchronous networks, and it turns out that no, it is not, and this is also fairly easy to show. We will see it shortly. But what our research shows is that there is an area in between these two extremes, namely a network condition where you have random delays, and these random delays could potentially be unbounded. So with some small chance you suffer very large delays, otherwise most often the delays are reasonable. And under this kind of network, Bitcoin continues to remain secure. And this is the contribution that I will talk about in more detail. So I'm going to begin with a very gentle introduction to Bitcoin and its security. So what do we mean by security? And then I will introduce the random delay model that we consider and how it's a relaxation of the bounded delay model that's considered in the literature. I'll spend some time talking about the technical details of the security guarantees, and it can broadly be split into two parts: some deterministic arguments where we have some counting argument, and then some probabilistic bounds based on simple random walks. And finally, I'll end with some broader perspectives on blockchain research. So let's get straight into it. What is ultimately Bitcoin? So various terms get associated with it: cryptocurrency, blockchain, etc. But I like to think of Bitcoin as a decentralized and democratic bank. Now, what does any bank do? It maintains a system that allows users to transact securely, which means that no one user should be able to spend somebody else's money, and you should not be able to spend more money than you have. And the way banks do this is by maintaining a ledger of all transactions. So a ledger is nothing but just a sorted list. So once you maintain a ledger, you can verify whether this is a valid transaction or whether it's not. So that's at the core of it, that's what any bank does. And in fact, modern banks are already decentralized to some extent, in the sense that this ledger does not sit on any one computer. It's spread across a whole host of servers, each storing a part of the ledger, and these servers need to be in constant sync with each other to present to the outside world the image of one seamless system. So what's new in Bitcoin? What's new in Bitcoin is that these servers are no longer under the control of one coordinating agency, but each are maintained by an individual who have no real connection with each other. So how can such a system seamlessly function, and in particular, is it robust if some parties start misbehaving or go missing from action? That is the core engineering challenge of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin solves this challenge via a remarkably simple protocol, which I illustrate here. And the thing to keep in mind that ultimately this is a mechanism for consensus among miners, which is what the peers in the Bitcoin system are called. So the first step is that a leader is chosen at random via some randomized mechanism, which I'll come to in a moment. And this leader then creates what is called a block of transactions. So a block is just a data structure that has some fixed number of transactions. Where does it get these transactions from? Well, users from outside the system are continuously making transactions, so there's always a pool of transactions available, from which some are picked up and made into a block. Now this leader then broadcasts this to all other peers, and the other peers go through the block, validate it, that is check if this block is a valid one, and then accept the block. And just this simple procedure is then repeated. So a new peer is chosen as a leader, they make a transaction, broadcast it on, and so on. And they arrange these blocks in the form of a simple chain, one after the other, and this chain of blocks is literally the blockchain which forms the ledger. Nowadays the term blockchain gets used to refer to the whole system, but it's coming from simply this data structure. So what about this randomized mechanism? So according to me, the main innovation in Bitcoin is really giving a very simple solution to this randomized leader election problem, and it's called proof of work. So what all these miners are expected to do is to try and solve a computationally hard problem, and the only way to solve this problem is really just generate random numbers one at a time and check whether they satisfy a certain a condition. So there's no smart algorithm to solve this problem, and the only way to increase your chances to be a leader is to have more computational power. Nowadays, people are also talking about proof of stake, which is a more energy efficient version. The aim is to give much of this, to keep as many properties the same as possible with proof of work, but it turns out that you do have a slightly more powerful adversary, which I'll highlight in a second. So if in a perfect network where all users are following the protocol and there are no network delays, that's all there is to the system. The chain of blocks keeps growing, and that is your ledger, and that's how the system progresses. But when there are network delays, some odd things might happen, which I'll illustrate shortly by this animation. So let's suppose this first person is chosen as a leader. They create a new block. Now they send across the block to the others. One block reaches fast, but the other takes a long time to reach. And in the process, this person gets chosen as a leader, and they create a new block of its own. So this can very well happen in a decentralized system. Remember, there's no coordinating agency. So if we take a slightly global picture, the blockchain is no longer a chain but more like a tree. So we say a fork has occurred in this blockchain. So two different blocks have been built at the same height, right? And clearly this is a problem. So now there is no one single ledger. You could either read it this way or this way, and it's really a problem if there are different transactions in these blocks. And then this could propagate further, so you can have a whole host of forks, and each possible fork is a different ledger. So forks can cause inconsistencies in the ledger. So what is the way out? Well, a simple solution was proposed. So firstly, whenever any peer sees a fork or any number of forks, they should always extend the longest chain that they know of. And if there are some ties like this, they can break the ties arbitrarily. They can choose to extend whichever block they may wish. That's as far as extending the blockchain is concerned. But there is also an important notion of when you would confirm a transaction. So when do you know that a transaction is going to remain in the blockchain forever? And to do that, the idea given is you only confirm blocks after a sufficient period of time has passed, namely say an hour or two, or equivalently after a block has been buried sufficiently deep below. So for example, in this setup, one would not confirm either of these blocks, but only these older ones, because one does not know which direction the chain will extend in. So this rule works in a way where you have occasional network delays, so forking is minimal. But clearly this rule would break down under a situation where you have two forks, sort of two chains growing in parallel, and they keep growing for a long period of time. And that indeed can happen when some players act roguely. So let's assume there is an adversary, which is a miner colluding with a client. So client is somebody making transactions, and initially one sees this state of affairs where a transaction is made by the adversary saying pay 1 Bitcoin to a car dealer. But then on purpose they create another block, not extending this one but in parallel, which says pay 1 Bitcoin to my friend. So this is a conflicting transaction. They create this, but they hold it privately. They don't broadcast this block to everybody. From this point on, there's essentially a race between the adversary who's extending this chain of its own privately and the rest of the peers who are working on this part of the blockchain without any knowledge of this chain at all. And the adversary at an opportune time will make its chain public and essentially erase this part of the ledger. And this is a serious security vulnerability, because the car dealer sort of, once this block is buried deep enough, would say, okay, the transaction is confirmed. They give the adversary the car, and then the next moment the adversary releases this, and this transaction is now off the ledger. So the adversary got the car for free, the car dealer was cheated. And in fact, network delays actually slow down the growth of the honest chain. As we saw, there is forking, so not all blocks build one on top of the other, and essentially network delays help the adversary. So when we say security of the blockchain, we really mean an attack like this, and so the effort will be to try and see when is it even remotely possible for an adversary to launch such an attack, and when it isn't. So with this intuition, let's try to make things a little formal. One can give a precise security definition. The first property we want is consistency. So for any pair of miners, we want that they hold the same chain, but of course we allow for some slack. So the chain, the initial part of the chain should be the same, and after some point on, even if they have different chains, it's okay. And a second property that we would like is that every now and then at least one honest block makes its way into each honest miner's chain, because if purely adversarial blocks get in, they could contain junk transactions for all we know. Usually liveness follows as a corollary of consistency, so the major effort is towards establishing the consistency property. And when we say the blockchain is secure, we mean that both liveness and consistency hold. And the kind of security result that we are chasing is that under appropriate conditions on the adversary and the network delays, this security property holds with high probability. So is that clear? Okay, so under what assumptions can we prove such a result? Well, one assumption that is always made is that nobody can tamper with the mining process or the block generation process. So blocks appear as a Poisson process of rate f. That means every so often somebody will get lucky, will solve the computational puzzle and produce a block, and this cannot be tampered with. So in continuous time that would be a Poisson process, in discrete time it's a Bernoulli process. And the adversary's fraction of computational power or representation power is beta. Think of beta as this number like 0.2 or 0.3. So that means with probability beta, each block is adversarial. Honest user suffers a bounded network delay. So the time taken for any message to get from one honest person to another is at most delta. It could be lesser. And the adversary does not suffer any delay. So adversary can receive messages instantaneously and send messages instantaneously. And what are messages? Messages are, we assume here, it's a modeling assumption, that they are entire chains. So we don't deal with the issue that you heard of one block but not the block before it. Of course that can happen in real life. We just assume that you hear of the latter block immediately after you hear the previous one. So that's it for the modeling assumptions. It's characterized by these three parameters, f, beta and delta, and everything is going to revolve around these. So what are the implications of this modeling assumption? So we saw that the adversary in its attack is trying to grow a chain as fast as possible. What's the fastest it can do so? It's a Poisson process of rate beta f, because that's the rate at which the adversary mines blocks. How about the honest user? So here things get a little tricky, but if one looks carefully, it turns out that the growth of an honest chain is essentially a renewal process with this renewal time. So a constant delta plus an exponential random variable with this parameter. And what is a renewal process? It's like a generalization of a Poisson process. So you have events occurring at certain intervals, and the gap between two events is a random variable with this distribution, and the gap is IID. So you have an event, you wait for a random amount of time, the next event happens, then you wait again another random period of time which has this distribution, and so on. So how do we get this? Let's take a look at that. So suppose there is this initial block, and then at time step 4 a new block was created. So if the delay bound delta is 5, until time step 9, in the worst case, no other honest user is going to hear of this block. So how many ever blocks are built, they are all going to be built in parallel to block 4. And moment the time step delta the time period delta passes, the next block is going to hear of block 4, and every block thereafter is going to extend block 4, and so on. So you wait for delta period of time, and thereafter you wait for the first honest block which occurs after this much time. This is a random variable, and therefore you grow by 1 after this period of time. And this, if you just invert it, the expected rate of growth is this quantity. And a necessary condition for security is that on average at least, the growth rate of the honest chain, which is this one, should be larger than the growth rate of the adversarial chain. And this one can reason by the arguments that I presented in the previous slide. So that condition boils down to this inequality. So this can be argued through fairly straightforward principles, as we just did. The harder part is to prove a sufficient condition on security. And I highlighted 2 works earlier. So the 2020 paper by Dembo et al. Shows that this necessary condition is also sufficient, and all previous works had a gap between necessary and sufficient. So these plots here highlight what is called the security threshold. So it's the largest possible beta, namely the fraction of adversary a system can handle given certain network conditions. So as your delays become smaller in this scale, it's 1 over delta on the x-axis. So as you go from left to right, the delays are becoming smaller. So as delays become smaller, you can tolerate a larger fraction of adversaries, and in the limit of delays being 0, you can tolerate 50%, up to 50% of the peers being adversarial. But as delays grow progressively larger, your tolerance goes down. And it's another remarkable contribution is they have the same threshold for both proof of work and proof of stake, despite having a stronger adversary in proof of stake. But this is just purely in terms of the security threshold. How about the actual probability that you would suffer a security violation? So that problem was tackled in this paper, and they give really tight bounds between an upper and lower bound. You see the gray curve is the lower bound, the blue the upper bound, and they practically match. So given any beta, f and delta, you see that the probability of security being violated actually decreases exponentially as you wait longer and longer. And it's exponential because you have an exponential scale here and a linear scale here. So that's the nature of security guarantees that we are chasing, but we want this under more relaxed network conditions. So now coming to the main contributions of our work. Our first contribution is to state formally a random delay model. So instead of end-to-end messages suffering bounded delay, we assume that each end-to-end message is assigned a random delta, and this delta could have any distribution, for example a geometric distribution with parameter 0.1. What this means is, on average the delays are about 10 seconds, but every now and then a message may be delayed by 1 minute, even 10 minutes, and there is really no bound that you can put. And we have some flexibility as well. It's not that all delays must satisfy this distribution. the delays could be arbitrary up to a stochastic upper bound. So think of it as the network imposes this random delay bound, but the adversary, if it so wishes, can deliver messages ahead of time. So it could be arbitrary within this bound. So we can think of a distribution which is like some delta naught, say 10 seconds with high probability 0.9, and otherwise it's infinity, so we don't care, it could be arbitrarily delayed after that. So there's no assumption on finite mean or any kind of conditions like that. So why do we expect random delays? Well, there are several sources of random delays in the network. Firstly, a Bitcoin network is ultimately a peer-to-peer network, so each peer connects to some random set of other nodes and they connect to some others. So the distance between two randomly chosen nodes is itself a random variable. So if you assume that there's a constant delay on each of these links and then you pick two nodes say uniformly at random, then the delay between them would be proportional to the number of hops between them, and that's a random quantity. And now one could even assume that one can further relax this and say, okay, the delays along any one link itself is random because of noise, traffic, etc. So there are various sources of random delays, and one gets some additional validation from this empirical study done way back in 2013, where people measured in the real Bitcoin network how long it takes for a block to get to every other block, and they saw this kind of nice distribution with exponential tail. So a large fraction of blocks are received within 10 seconds, but every so often you have some blocks taking up to a minute to be received. So one would naively expect that Bitcoin should be secure even under this random delay assumption. If a block takes too long, just simply ignore it as if it never was mined, and the rest of the block should kind of follow the same pattern as in the bounded delay setting. So we thought it should be a fairly easy problem to solve, but turns out that it is. Analyzing it theoretically throws up some challenges, and I want to highlight some of the challenges here. As I mentioned, one fundamental thing to study is the chain growth process, and under random delays one loses some of the nice properties that one has under bounded delays. For example, a new block may attach at any level of the blockchain, not necessarily at the bottom or just one above. This will never happen when you have bounded delays. So if given that 8 heard of 6, 9 must also, a later block must have also heard of this block 6 and therefore would attach here. It's also possible under random delays that new blocks may hear of the previous block but not of the earlier one. So block that arrived at time 14 may have heard of block 9 but not block 8.
You're confused when you say block heard of. So your model is all these parties here. What do you mean by block?
Correct. So sorry, I define it a bit later. But yeah, when I say one block hears of a previous block, it means the miner of that block at the time of mining the block has received this other block. So just this one miner has heard of, has received that block.
You say when it's a bounded delay, the miner should have heard of 8 or 6.
So this analysis is always done under the worst case delay. So worst case delay under bounded delay means just constant delay. So given that a miner at time 8 has heard of a block mined at time 6, all miners, it means all miners have heard of the block by then. So therefore any later block that appears would at least know of block 6 and therefore would extend this one.
So you're considering 9 as something that was created after somebody created 8.
Yeah, sorry. So I should have mentioned these numbers are timestamps.
When it was created.
When it was created.
Global clock.
Yeah, so this is just for the sake of illustration. The timestamps are not used in the protocol in any way. It's just for the sake of illustration. So this is the initial block that's available at time 0. This is the first block created, the second block created, and the third and the fourth. And these are random numbers because the gap between any two blocks is random. So another point to mention right here is from here after we consider a discrete time model as an approximation to the continuous one. And lastly, the probability of extending the chain actually depends on the structure of the blockchain. So for example, given that there are now two blocks at the tip, so to speak, and any new block thereafter actually has an increased chance of extending the chain. So it's difficult to put a uniform bound on the probability that the next block is going to increase the chain length. So all of these complications make it much harder to pin down a growth rate for this process. And we'll see that even we are just able to give a lower bound and not the precise characterization of this process still remains open. So the key observation,
Like you mentioned that the 9 is seen by the network, 6 is already been seen by all the miners.
Not under random delays, only under bounded delays. So if the delays are constant, that means everybody receives the block at exactly the same time. But under random delays, the delays could really be arbitrary, right? So this delay from the miner of block 6 to miner of block 8 could be small, and the delay from miner of block 6 to 9 could be large. So note that each message could have a different delay because different peers are at different distances in the network. The communication links are all different. So if I send a message, you may receive it fast, but Professor Manoj may receive it later. So that's yeah.
The protocol allows asynchronous creation and attachment to any.
Yeah, sure. So the
for example, if I have to add 9, do I need to get the network that I know of 8 or I know of 6 or I know of 0?
No. So because there is no one entity called the network. So the only thing that any miner knows of is the set of blocks that it has heard of. So it has to act based on local information.
And the top was 0.
Yeah, so 0 is something that's kind of there initially, right at the very beginning of time. So everybody knows of block 0. So the starting point is common. But so that's, perhaps missed the initial slide. So everybody has a local view, and this is really a global view where we put together all blocks ever created. So no one peer has this global view. We can put it on a slide for the sake of analysis. Right. So to come back, the key observation we make is that the probability that the miner of any new block B receives any previous block B prime is at least this quantity, where delta is a typical random delay and G denotes the interval between two blocks which has a geometric distribution with parameter f. So why is this? So G is so the time that has elapsed between one block and the previous one is at least G. It could be more if you are looking back multiple blocks, but if B prime is just the previous block, then the time elapsed is at least G. And the delays are, so the mining process is independent of anything else in the network, which is a fair assumption. So the delay delta is independent of G. And this delta is also a random variable. So what's the probability that one random variable delta is less than another random variable G? So typically if the delays are small and much smaller than the scale at which blocks are arriving, you expect this number to be large, but as delays grow, this number starts reducing. So with this observation, we define what is called a special honest block.
So it could also, because of the randomness, it could also happen that you get a child block before you get its parent.
Right. So yeah, I discussed that. We model that as if messages are entire chains. So if you get a message and with a new block, you get everything. And practically speaking, what that would mean is, if you get a new block if you get a child without its parent, you don't assume that you have received the child. You receive the child only after you get the parent. And so everything is shoved under the yeah. But yes, good point. So what is a special honest block? It's a recursive definition.
So when you do that, this Poisson process assumption is it still valid? Like you said, receive the child, I can keep it in a stash as a holding parent. Then when the parent arrives, suddenly, maybe this child and its children, they all arrive immediately.
So the Poisson process assumption is for when the blocks arrive to anybody in sort of the network as a whole. That still holds. Yeah, so we don't assume that any one honest miner is receiving new messages at that rate. Right? So they receive messages in a somewhat arbitrary order as governed by the delays.
So suddenly these delays have a different distribution, right? You're pretending that this message is within the arrival.
Right. Yes.
It started arriving very quickly.
Exactly. So yeah, so the delays the distribution of the delays does change, and that's what I mentioned about sort of having some flexibility in the model regarding the stochastic domination. So let's suppose there's block 1 and there's block 2. Block 1 is the parent of block 2. Yeah, speeding up is allowed. So there's no issue with speeding up. Exactly. Yeah, that's a good succinct way of putting it. So we don't have any issues with speeding up. But as you will see, the analysis is always, so you want to lower bound the growth rate of the honest chain, so we always kind of take worst case delays. So hereafter we just assume that delays are having that distribution delta that we speak of. And this is, so of course it's easier said than done, so that it requires some care, but the analysis is always under worst case delays. So we say rather the adversary has the ability to rush messages, and we factor that into account. And that's why so the probability of good events are always bounded from below. So the good event occurs at least with this probability, perhaps more. Right. So to recall, what is a special honest block? It's a recursive definition. Let's suppose the initial block is just marked as special honest, and thereafter an honest block is special honest if its miner has heard of or received the previous special honest block when it is mined. So one can go through the list of honest blocks and just mark, okay, this is special, this is not, this is special, so on and so forth. And given this recursive definition, we know that these special honest blocks must be at distinct heights in that block tree that we drew, because they are all following the longest chain rule. If they know of a block at a certain height, so that's the minimum height chain that they know of, and therefore the new block that they will create would be at a strictly longer height. They may or may not extend that very block, but at least it's at a distinct height. And further, we have a lower bound on the probability with which each block is special honest. It's honest with probability 1 minus beta, and this is the probability with which it satisfies this condition. So the probability with which it is special honest is the product of the two, and this is independent of the past. So putting these facts together, we get a lower bound on the growth rate of the honest chain, right? It is basically it's a lower bound on the growth rate of the special honest blocks. And just to emphasize that it's indeed a lower block, I plot here a special case where delay is either 0 or infinity. So it's infinity with probability d, which I plot on the x-axis. For the special honest rate, so this probability factor is just 1 minus d, and that's the special honest rate drawn in orange, and the true growth rate is the curve given in blue. And why is there a gap? It's for the reason I mentioned a couple of slides earlier. When you have multiple blocks at the tip, you actually have a larger chance of extending the chain, and that's something the special honest strategy does not factor into account. Good. So now we are poised to see how special honest blocks help in the security analysis. So first I'll present the deterministic part, which is namely a counting argument with blocks, and then we move to the probabilistic part where we work with some random processes. So we start with assuming that this consistency condition is violated at time t, and for illustration let's put some numbers. So pick any slot s, and everything is with respect to slot s. I pick k equal to 30 and time t as s plus 40, right? So clearly this consistency is violated. So what if consistency is violated? There must be two different chains, one held by one honest person, another by another honest miner, that diverge back up to slot up to a point before slot s, right? So once again recall, these numbers here are the timestamps of the blocks. And we know that each special honest block must be at a distinct height. So for example, let the black blocks be the special honest one. What this means is, if an adversary wants to create this kind of a fork, it must match each special honest block with one of its own, right? So for example, the red blocks could be the adversarial blocks, right? So we have split this fork into adversarial blocks and special honest blocks, and we have said that the number of adversarial blocks must be at least the number of special honest blocks. So that is the fundamental argument, right, which says that adversary can't create this for free, it must have enough number of blocks in order to do so. Now let's refine this argument a little bit. So this is what we concluded at the end of the previous slide, but if we are a bit more careful, we may realize that actually, for example, block number 28 need not be an adversarial block. It could just be an honest block that was not special. So block number 28 could have been mined by an honest miner. It just did not hear of 25 and is therefore not special, and it heard of block 21, so it attached there. So basically the adversary has some extra power in the form of these non-special honest blocks, and for the rest of the discussion we'll just treat all non-special honest blocks as adversarial. So we just have two kinds of blocks, special and adversarial. Second, the adversary may have some initial advantage from blocks created before time slot s. So how does that work? So think of exactly the same configuration, but just change these timestamps from s to s minus 7. So now this block 5 is actually a block mined at time step s minus 2, and that is not accounted for in this term. Right? This is only counting blocks from time s plus 1 onwards. So we must take into account some initial advantage of the adversary, and all of that can be clubbed into one scalar term called reach. And so the reach at time s is the initial advantage the adversary has, and it adds on to whatever blocks it produces from s plus 1 to t. And a last thing to take into account is that there may actually be more special honest blocks that have been mined in the system, but an honest miner may not have heard of it, right? And therefore this block exists in the system but does not belong to any chain of honest miner. So this term needs to be subtracted off from the number of special honest blocks in the system. So that's it. With this, the counting argument ends. We have obtained a necessary condition for security violation in terms of these quantities, and we'll see that each of these quantities are simple random processes which we can control probabilistically. So let's just rewrite that necessary condition into a sufficient one by changing the direction of the inequality. So we have the difference between adversarial and special, and then we have that initial advantage of the adversary, and then we have this unheard term which gets subtracted from the special. So all of this must be negative, and not just at any one time t, but forever after time s plus k. So is this possible? Is this viable? And can this happen with high probability? That's the question we ask. And it turns out that yes, it is possible to analyze these terms and give high probability guarantees. One thing that we do to simplify is just change the time scale of these processes. So we just sample at the event time scale, namely whenever blocks arrive. And if you do that, observe that this difference is a term that either goes up by 1 or down by 1. So every new block is either special or adversarial. If it's adversarial, this term goes up by 1. If it's special, it goes down by 1, right? And it's also random because each block is adversarial or special with some certain distribution, and therefore this term behaves like a random walk with a certain drift, and it has a negative drift if the probability of special honest blocks is larger than the probability of adversarial blocks.
Block arrival in one particular party and thinking of what it sees?
No, this is a global analysis. So for the sake of analysis, we can take a global picture.
How do you define when a block gets created in the binary tree itself? Is that the point?
Yeah, so the block arrival is just a Bernoulli process. So at each discrete time slot t, either a block is created or not. It's created with probability f.
Just from the point of view of the miner of that.
No, this is a global perspective, right? So a new block has been created in the system
Created by its miner.
by its miner, right? Yeah, not necessarily received by anybody else. And that's precisely why we had this unheard thing, right? Because the security condition applies to one, but you pick two honest users, see their chains, and therefore one has to take that into account. That's precisely why. And it will make an appearance even later. We need to, so there's actually an unheard process for every miner in the system, and we need a uniform bound over all of them, and we'll see that in a moment. So what about this reach term? It turns out the reach term is actually intricately linked to this very, the difference between adversarial and special honest, except we have to look back in time, because we said it's the initial advantage. And it's a standard result in queuing theory that this process behaves like a geometric, has the distribution of a geometric random variable. And again, the closer the probability of these two are, the larger this geometric variable gets. The more advantage the special honest have, the smaller is the mean of this geometric distribution. So that term behaves in a straightforward manner as well. Now we come to unheard, and unheard is basically how stale is your information. So it has an age of information like flavor for those who work in that area. And again, its behavior is rather simple. We are sampling at the scale of whenever blocks arrive. So with every new special honest block that appears in the system, either this new block is received by the miner in question or not. So if it's received, it goes up by 1. If it's not received, the unheard goes up by 1. But if the new miner receives it, this unheard term goes down to 0, because you have the latest information. And most importantly, you can lower bound the probability of this event, where by just this term, probability delta less than g. So to get some feel for how these quantities behave, here's just a simulation of these terms. So I club together the reach term with this random walk-like term in the blue curve. So that has a downward drift, right? So this is under conditions where probability of a special honest block is 0.6 and probability of an adversarial block is 0.4. And then the unheard term, I just flip it over and describe it in terms of this orange curve. And why do I do that? Because now the sufficient condition for security is that the blue line must remain below the orange line forever after a certain time k. And one can see that this is likely to happen given that the blue curve has this downward drift, whereas the orange curve does not kind of grow with time. And how do we make this argument precise? So let this dashed line denote the average behavior of this random walk, so called the drift, and create a boundary between these two terms which has roughly half the slope of this blue line. So it's with high probability this jagged blue curve remains below the red line forever after time k, and this orange curve remains above the red line forever after time s plus k. So to be precise, this unheard curve is less than some linearly growing bound, and for all time this we get via a simple union bound. And then this random walk term remains below the same term with the sign flipped around, and this we get via something called Kingman's tail bound. Once again, it's a tool used in queuing theory to bound the maximum of a sum of random variables which have negative mean. So adding these two together, we get that the sufficient condition for security holds with high probability. So to wrap things up, suppose there are h different honest miners and one adversary with beta fraction power. So it's fair to assume one adversary because there are no communication delays. And let the mining rate of the system be f, that's the rate at which new blocks are produced globally, and therefore the interblock times is given by the geometric distribution with mean f, 1 over f. And let delta denote the typical random delay in the network. And assume that beta is bounded in a way that 1 minus beta times probability delta less than g is strictly greater than a half. So this is, we need this condition. Then the probability that the security is violated for any honest miner or any pair of honest miners is bounded above by this term that decreases exponentially with this parameter k. So the longer you are willing to wait, k is the latency parameter, how long you are willing to wait, your security violation probability decreases exponentially with that. Of course you expect it to be multiplied by f because that's the rate at which things happen. You just slow down the mining rate, then everything slows down. And we also see that you get worse security as epsilon goes down to 0, because epsilon is like your margin that you have between the special honest blocks and the adversarial blocks. So why do we have a sum of two terms? One term comes from the bound on that random walk, the blue curve that I showed, staying below the red line, and this one comes from the bound on the unheard term. But note that it gets multiplied by the number of honest miners h, and that's because we need a separate bound for each honest miner, and by the union bound you get a linear scaling. So what are the key takeaways? We get qualitatively similar, sorry? Yeah, so for, sure, if you have an infinite number of miners, yes? Right, so that is true, but mind you that at least within this model, especially if you have any kind of unbounded delay, even geometric delays, you cannot give a high probability guarantee for infinite number of users, because in fact there will always be a user that has not heard of any message like think of like trillions of users, and there might be just that one user out there who's not heard of any message. So if you
then ask the question, maybe we should talk about the probability security violated for substantial number of
so
maybe you're okay to sacrifice a small.
Right. So basically this term, mind you, is if I as just a client of the system am suffering from poor internet, then I will get worse security guarantees, because this is coming from the unheard factor just for myself. So yeah, I qualified right at the beginning that there are H honest miners where H is some moderate number, and therefore I can write this. But a different way of writing the same guarantee is that the security is violated for any subset of miners of cardinality H is this. So I can put H for, so I identify ahead of time, I care only about this subset of parties in the system which have a cardinality of size H, and then I give this.
People say 99% of the users will be okay with this probability. You're trying to talk in terms of large X, but
sure.
it is not violated for
Sure. Yeah, that is one way of doing it. But then we can't tell ahead of time what are those 99%.
Yeah, that was another question I had. So in your model, it's like something very uniform, right? All indices are the same network delay distribution.
Right.
But if there were, the network graph had, congestions or whatever, the separate into parts of the graph is like conductors. So the graph structure makes it the delay distribution different for different parties. I don't know, things are already complicated, but I guess it will become even more complicated. But maybe there's a small part of the network one going to be sacrificed because they are very poorly connected to the network.
Right.
They have a different delay distribution.
So one thing is, that's why we also come to the key takeaways. So it kind of brings out the flavor of security in a variety of network conditions. So one thing is, if your network is partitioned into 2 clusters or 3 clusters, then what will happen is each of them will have their own chains and they are kind of in sync with each other, but communication across them is poor. So you'll see 2 chains growing in parallel or 3 in parallel. And every now and then a message gets across, so one party builds a longer chain and the message gets across, so then everybody switches to that.
Terrible situation for the guarantee.
Yeah, so then basically the adversarial power needs to be contained to the maximum of within one group. But
even then, right, so maybe go back to the security definition, the guarantees we have.
This one or the definition way back, okay.
Like if the adversary could switch so there will be some kind of a consistency, right? So
Right.
it will be the same forever.
Right.
But for, once it has been okay for case steps,
Right, exactly.
that K will be, you cannot get a good K at all.
Possibly, yes. The poorer the link is, and of course if the link is absolutely broken, then yes.
Because it's absolutely broken, yeah, then
there's no guarantee.
But on the other hand, it's not so bad because locally each user will have, or there will be a subset which has its own consistency and another subset.
Sure.
But if there is a small link between these two things, then things will keep flipping.
Sure, yes. Things will keep flipping. So perhaps, that finer point is not captured in this definition, right?
Not much you can give in that situation.
Right. One thing that does come out here in our work is, oops, let me go back to or maybe this slide, is that there's a different role between the delays among the miners, at least the large fraction of miners, because they control, those delays control this term, and then the delays suffered by kind of the rest of the people who are not really mining, they are not creating new blocks, but are just listening in and are maintaining the ledger, which would be a much larger number of people who are just interested in using Bitcoin. Because as we know, a large fraction of the mining is actually done by a small group of people in network pools. So they can invest in high bandwidth, etc. And then the system as a whole has good guarantees because this delay, the corresponding delay is small there. But then any user who's not actively maintaining blocks, they suffer poor guarantees, but that does not affect the rest of the miners. So the delays actually have kind of dual roles here.
Also, I'm wondering why this improves with increasing error.
So it doesn't. So it improves with increasing f, but at the same time, if you increase f, this term goes down. Your epsilon goes down because g becomes a smaller variable. G is a variable with mean 1 over f. So the probability with which this event happens goes down.
Mining rate is increasing. You are mining blocks at a higher and higher frequency.
Right. So there's probably a sweet spot where.
I think that could affect you to a much worse guarantees.
Yeah. So you can't increase f arbitrarily, because if you increase f, make a f arbitrarily large, in fact this whole thing will even become less than a half.
That condition will not work.
Yeah. So if your typical delays are like say 10 seconds, which is say the case for the Bitcoin network, and Bitcoin currently operates, chooses an F where one block is mined every once in 10 minutes. So that's being really conservative. So if you make that once in 10 minutes to once in 1 minute, you would actually get faster confirmation because more blocks are coming up, just things are speeded up. But if you go from 1 minute down to 10 seconds, then you get that increased forking and you don't get as good a guarantee.
Epsilon square f that you're interested in, not f makes it, right?
Yeah.
And is there, maybe it doesn't matter if you're discretizing and you're assuming that each time step just one block.
Yeah, so that is simplicity of assumption, which is valid under small enough.
But like I said, in that discrete times if multiple blocks are in, it shouldn't change much. It's like these think of them as are one after the other.
So if multiple blocks arrive, you kind of think of one of them as special. At most, one of them could be special honest, and the second is not. So you treat it as a non-special but honest block. And there are works that do that carefully enough, but it just makes things a little more complicated with essentially the same flavor. So you can just analyze. I mean, the system could be at a certain natural time scale, and for the discretization is merely an analysis tool, and you can make it arbitrarily small where it's a fair assumption to say there's at most one block per time step. So that also people realized with time. So the initial papers, they chose kind of moderate. They chose the intervals to be such that the messages are delivered within that block, within that time step. So they chose a large, and therefore you have to account for possibly multiple blocks in a time step. But then people realize it's easier to do it the other way. Right. So let me quickly wrap up. I would say the main takeaway here is that this longest chain protocol used by Bitcoin is robust to sporadic excess network delays, and therefore one does not need to be very conservative with the choice of the mining rate. One does not choose the mining rate keeping in mind the worst case delay, but rather the typical delay. So if the typical delay is 10 seconds, you choose your mining rate so that there's one block, say, every minute.
But the mining rate is, can it be really exogenously decided? Like suppose if these are financial transactions, mining rate is created by how often the transactions are happening?
It's rather the other way around. The transactions that actually get incorporated in the Bitcoin network are throttled by the mining rate, and therefore you actually have a game theoretic aspect here. So if you really want your transaction through, you pay a higher mining fee, or a higher transaction fee, so that a miner is incentivized to take yours instead of another one. And that's an altogether different problem. I'll just briefly allude to it towards the end. Maybe in the interest of time, I will skip this, but let's just end with mentioning that this is the security aspect of Bitcoin is just one thread of Bitcoin research. There are several other interesting questions to ask in the context of Bitcoin. One is that of efficiency. You want to process many more transactions as possible. Here you're limited by your block size and the block generation rate. So people have thought of what are called layer 2 solutions. So here you create a gadget by means of a proper Bitcoin transaction, and then this gadget allows you to transact securely without recording your transactions on the blockchain. So you have taken the transactions off the chain, and one such thing is called payment channel network, which is a topic that I'm working on. And then there are other aspects of efficiency, namely storage, computation, etc. Do you really need to store this entire history? Does everybody need to store the entire history? And there are solutions where only a few parties store the entire history and the rest can securely gather any information from them as and when necessary. Privacy is actually another important challenge, and it's becoming increasingly more important, especially as people are talking about using blockchains for various real world applications. And this is pure, in my belief, it's purely in the domain of cryptography, where there has been some exciting recent progress, in fact inspired with the potential use case in blockchains. And finally, another aspect of blockchain research is to think about real world use cases. So currently the only viable use case has been as a digital transaction system like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and there too you're paying a price for decentralization. So even just for it to be economically viable, the transaction fees are rather large, which makes it infeasible for day-to-day use. So what are other real world use cases where one might want to pay this a cost for having decentralization? And according to me, one use case is where you have decentralized marketplaces, and let me illustrate this by an example. So think of something like Uber, where we are usually ride seekers and there are those who are offering rides, and Uber is playing the role of a coordinator, matching riders to drivers. But now think of the role that Uber plays being done in a decentralized fashion, namely the drivers themselves organize in a way so as to provide that service. So the whole matching algorithm and the pricing algorithm, all of that takes place in a decentralized fashion. So is it possible? Can it be done? Is it viable? These are interesting questions which I think are going to be tackled in the second decade of blockchain research. And with that, I would like to end my talk. Thank you for all of those who joined in person and online. The work that I spoke about is published in the journal Stochastic Systems. You can find it online. I would like to thank my co-author, Shreyas, an undergraduate student who worked with me, and my advisor, Professor Bruce Hajek. And with that, yeah.
We are way over time.
Right.
I don't know if there is anybody still online. Just check before we close the. Nobody.
I mean, did I speak for too long or?
We started too late.